This is a load management dialogue presented by PLMA. Here you'll discover practitioner perspectives on flexible energy load management, demand response, and distributed energy resources. And now let me turn over today's presentation to our moderator, Kessie Avsakova of Opinion Dynamics and a co-chair of PLMA's Electric Transportation Interest Group. Please take it away, Kessie.
Thank you, Rich. Hi, everyone. We are so excited that you're able to join us for this load management dialogue. U.S. climate goals for greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2050 require pretty rapid decarbonization of across the board, across the entire economy, but more specifically of the light-duty vehicle fleets. And electric vehicles, plug-in electric vehicles, are poised to become this preferred technology for achieving this goal. And considerable investments in public and private EV charging infrastructure will be needed for sure to support this widespread adoption. And needless to say, there is guidance on when, where, and what types of chargers, what types of infrastructure needs will be needed across the United States is lacking. And as established by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Board, the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation has set this vision for a national charging network that is convenient, affordable, reliable, also equitable, that can ultimately help enable a future where everyone can ride and drive electric. NREL study, the one that we're going to be sharing today with you, supports this vision. And the study focused on a quantitative needs assessment for a national charging network capable of supporting up to 42 million plug-in electric vehicles on the road by 2030. I am excited to welcome Brennan Borlaug to share insights from this recently completed NREL study as part of this load management dialogue. Walk us through some of the findings, some of the research that was conducted, as well as a suite of tools that will be available through NREL to support further explorations, investigation, and forecasting. Just a little bit about Brennan. Brennan is a research analyst in the Transportation Energy Transitions Analysis Group at the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL. He conducts modeling and analysis in support of the deployment of zero-emission vehicles and associated infrastructure throughout the United States and occasionally outside of the United States. Brendan is a graduate of the Master of Information and Data Science program at the University of California, Berkeley, and he also holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Washington State University. Brendan resides in Colorado. Brendan, I welcome you to take us away on this fun exploration of the study, the findings, and some tools.
Great, thanks, Kessie. I'm hoping that you guys can see my slides. Just checking. Everything look good? Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you again for that introduction. It's great to virtually be here today. As Kessie said, my name is Brennan Borlaug. I'm a researcher at the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL. And today I'll be discussing some of the more recent analyses and modeling tools that are coming out of our lab that we think can be helpful for planning, charging infrastructure, and preparing for future electric vehicles. So some of you may be familiar with NREL. Just in case any of you aren't, we're one of the US Department of Energy's 17 national labs. We're the only one that's solely dedicated to the research and advancement of renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies. And our main campus, as shown here, is in Golden, Colorado. We have a fairly large workforce of around 3,000. We have these world-class facilities, and we have a campus that is somewhat unique in that it operates as a living lab, where we can actually deploy and test new technologies, working with industry within a more limited environment before, and then taking kind of some of these learnings before they are brought to market, by industry. And in general, so the Department of Energy is our primary client. They're who we work most closely with, but we do have partnerships with many others in industry, academia, and other government agencies as well, including many active and past projects with utilities. So at a high level, these are kind of the 4 core research areas at NREL. But the topics today are going to mainly fall within the sustainable transportation category, and specifically vehicle electrification. But that's how I just want to show this to convey that NREL has wide-ranging expertise across many topics, specifically related to decarbonized energy systems. So here are the contents of my talk. I'll start with some background just to contextualize the need for EV infrastructure modeling and analysis in the first place. I'll then just briefly introduce NREL's suite of tools within this area, which we've collectively called EVIX. I'll then kind of go into some detail on this national analysis of light-duty EV infrastructure needs that was recently released, before providing some of our early perspectives on charging for larger, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles as well. And then finally, I'll be wrapping up with just some very high-level conclusions and reserving some time at the end for Q&A. So just briefly, as we all know, historically, transportation has been the least diversified U.S. economic sector by energy use. It's largely powered by petroleum products. In fact, today, it's responsible for around 70% of total petroleum use in the United States. But the landscape is changing. So battery costs have declined around 90% since 2010 and are expected to continue to drop, throughout the rest of the decade. EVs themselves now represent over 10% of global car sales. This is just around 7 to 8% in the US, though, it's not evenly distributed. It's much higher in some states like California, where sales are already exceeding 20% this year. And it's important to note that these trends, they're all prevalent really before this recent stretch of very strong policy support across all levels of government. And the most recent one that's top of mind being EPA's proposed 2027 later multi-pollutant rule. So this expects to require, 2/3 of new cars and around 1/4 of heavy truck sales to be zero emission vehicles by 2032. The majority of which are going to likely be EVs, just due to kind of the maturity of that technology as compared to some other alternatives. So it's safe to say that EVs are finally going mainstream, just as the technology matures and costs have declined. And this is great news for the climate, since electric vehicles, they do offer a pathway for decarbonizing on-road transport when they are charged with clean electricity. And I already touched on this, but this slide actually graphically reinforces that the trend toward global electrification is well underway, and it's kind of seen across all major markets. So yeah, we are on this path towards large-scale electrification already. But despite this, there are still barriers that must be addressed if we're going to reach our ambitious decarbonization targets. And a really large one is just being that it's still a major point of uncertainty and concern as to how and where consumers are going to charge their EVs, once they buy them. And we're already seeing that this could be potentially holding back adoption today. So a recent survey from Consumer Reports showed that for those that are not planning to buy or lease an EV for their next vehicle, their primary concern, so more than 60%, were concerned with how they would charge those vehicles. And a study in Nature Energy that was quite interesting looked at EV discontinuance, which is basically when a consumer originally purchases an EV, but then eventually abandons it in favor of a conventional vehicle for one reason or another in a subsequent purchase. So in that study, they found that dissatisfaction with the convenience of charging and not having a level 2 charger installed at their home, these were kind of two of the main causes for discontinuance amongst EV buyers. So it could be something that causes us to actually revert and go in the opposite direction from where we need to be. So the current administration, they recognize this concern. They've established ambitious goals, both to grow domestic EV and charging markets through the end of the decade. Namely, they're targeting 50% zero emission vehicle sales and 500,000 new EV chargers installed by the end of the decade. And those targets, they're not actually backed by federal policies. So just namely, the bipartisan infrastructure law provides funding for building out the national network of EV chargers that we'll need. And then the Inflation Reduction Act includes tax credits for EV and EVSE purchases that can lower the costs for consumers. And then again, if this new EPA proposed rule goes into effect, that's going to clearly be a major, if not the primary driver of future electrification within the United States. But all that said, there is this major uncertainty for those who are tasked with deploying or managing this new infrastructure. And that said, it's hard to predict what the charging requirements are going to be over time within their regions. It's hard to know how many chargers are going to be needed, by when, where they should be located. And all this kind of makes the task of planning for EVs, especially when you're dealing with lead times for installing this infrastructure of 1 to 2 years in some cases, it becomes particularly challenging planning problem. So at a high level, power producers and distributors that are tasked with doing this proactive planning, they kind of need to do, they need to project when, where, and how much electricity and infrastructure is going to be needed to accommodate future EVs. And I've outlined kind of three of these individual complex modeling steps that need to happen in order to be able to make those projections. So first, you must predict when and where EVs are going to be adopted. So that on its own is complicated. It involves, estimating and understanding consumer preferences, fleet turnover patterns, projecting what technology improvements are going to be within the market, and then also looking at the availability of different EV modeling options and just how many of them are actually going to be coming to market over time. Next, you need to simulate how EVs are going to be operated. So looking at differences in driving requirements that can actually vary by household or region. You need an understanding of when and where vehicles are parked and can potentially charge during the day. And really, you need to understand other EV-specific driving preferences and charging behaviors. And then finally, you model, again, how EVs are actually charged. So looking at, is there access to EV charging at the places where these vehicles are typically parked? Again, looking at the preferences for charging for drivers and costs that would be associated with that. And then also looking at the potential to, shift or modify EV charging demands to better accommodate the grid, and kind of, what costs would have to be passed to the consumer to achieve that level of flexibility. So at NREL, we've developed an extensive suite of EV infrastructure modeling tools over the years. They make up this EVIX suite, which is shown here. Each of these bubbles kind of represents a separate model that we've developed. But at a high level, we've grouped them into three broad categories. So we have network planning tools, a network and station economics tool, and then site design tools. And I'll briefly touch on each of these in the subsequent slides here. So for site design, we have a tool called EVIN Site. It's an agent-based charging station simulator, and we use it to kind of answer research questions like, how should EV charging stations be designed? What is the average peak and total energy demand for a particular station? What is a load profile on a given day, and how does it vary from day to day? These types of questions. And the model itself takes many different configurable, design parameters. So you can really specify the type of station that you'd like to study, looking at like station power capacity, if there's power sharing across the different units, the number of ports, looking at port power levels, the vehicles that are arriving at the station. Then ultimately, it will simulate station operations, producing these site level load profiles that we use for grid integration studies. And yeah, there's a link here if anybody's interested in learning more. That's kind of all I have to just introduce this tool. Second, we have a EVI Fast. So this is a a publicly available EV station financial analysis spreadsheet tool. It's meant to be kind of simple to use and understand with highly configurable inputs, including station design parameters like EVI Insight uses, assumptions around how chargers are utilized and how that increases over time, the costs associated with installing and operating chargers, any incentives, different financing assumptions, and more. And ultimately, what it does is it calculates a few key financial metrics, such as the investor payback period, the net present value, and the levelized cost of charging calculated over the station's lifetime. So it can develop kind of all of these metrics that can be helpful for planning, financial planning, for a given station scenario, and is really conducive to sensitivity analyses and uncertainty analyses as well. So we've used it for multiple DOE analyses over the years, and again, have a link here if you're interested in learning more. Finally, there are several network planning tools that we use to model charging demands for EVs. Each one kind of covers a different use case. And all of these models, they follow a similar approach where they ingest real-world operating data. This is, I think, exclusively to this point has come from conventional gas-powered vehicles. We simulate them as electric, so we simulate EVs as a one-to-one replacement for a gas vehicle, simulate their charging demands, and then design an infrastructure around those charging demands that's capable of kind of meeting peak demand while minimizing potential queuing time or congestion on the network. So yeah, shown here are just the three core models that we use for simulating light-duty EV demands. Starting with EVI Pro, it simulates the charging demands for typical daily travel, and it focuses on destination charging in particular. So looking at charging at locations like homes and workplaces. And this focus on destination charging enables EVI Pro to model different charging preferences and even implement different managed charging strategies that can be used to assess their impacts on aggregate EV load profiles within a region, and then also looking at the network requirements for enabling that additional flexibility. The second model is EVI Road Trip. This one simulates charging and infrastructure along highway corridors in support of long distance travel. So the majority of this demand is modeled as en route DC fast charging demand with limited flexibility. But this model is very good for designing a national network that can provide full coverage while also dealing with capacity at each individual station depending on historical road trip patterns and understanding how that might scale over time. So this is very relevant to the Joint Office's NEVI program. And then lastly, EVI On Demand estimates on-shift DC fast charging for ride-hail EVs. So yeah, it might seem curious why we had to create an entire model just for ride-hail EVs since they make up such a small share of the total vehicle fleet. But what we found is that they actually stand to represent a disproportionate share of urban fast charging demands. And that's for a few different reasons. So first, ride-hail companies like Lyft and Uber, they have very aggressive fleet electrification targets, planning to electrify their US operations by 2030. So if they're able to hit those targets, they're going to be electrifying much faster than the fleet in general, which is very relevant for planning over the next 5 to 10 years. Second, ride-hail vehicles are driven more than regular vehicles, and they have shifts that often last 4 or more hours, which in some cases could mean that their shift mileage actually exceeds the range of a battery electric vehicle and would require en route charging, which is important to capture. And then finally, survey data has also shown that ride-hail drivers, they're more likely to live in multifamily homes compared to the general population, which we model as having a more limited access to home charging, meaning they would be more dependent on public charging networks. And this is just a sort of call to action slide. So it says integrated systems modeling and analysis. They can be, a useful tool in preparing for the impacts of the U.S. Energy transition. And it just kind of leads us into the recent 2030 National Charging Network Study, which is kind of the main topic of this talk. So the goal of this study was to use some of NREL's quantitative modeling in order to start to provide some insights for this major uncertainty that I mentioned around EV infrastructure requirements and planning for them. And so the chart on this slide shows the 3 NREL modeled national adoption trajectories. These are the ones that we used in our analysis. And they resulted in, so they're fairly aggressive is kind of the first thing to point out here. They resulted in a 2030 fleet size of between 30 million and 42 million personal EVs on the road, with this 33 million scenario here used for our baseline. Just for reference, this corresponds to roughly 12 to 16% or so of the total light duty fleet as EVs in 2030, and around 50% sales by 2030, which is in line with the federal target. Here's the scope of our modeling outputs, which I show because they're considerably more detailed than any of the other studies that we were able to find in the literature. So our results include port counts and capital costs. Primarily port counts and capital costs for EV infrastructure, though we are also producing hourly load profiles as well. The vehicle segment that we're looking at is personally owned light duty vehicles. And the time frame was, we produced annual projections starting in 2022, which was kind of the initial year that we actually started the study, and then proceeding out to 2030. The spatial resolution of our modeling is shown here on the map. It contains around 400 large metro areas, 550 or so smaller towns or micro areas. And then in green, we kind of have these rural state areas, which kind of capture the rest of the United States. But in total, this leads to around 1,000 distinct geographies for which we're producing results across the U.S. In our bottom-up modeling framework. Where we get really detailed is in the way that we're reporting out results. So, as shown in this taxonomy figure on this slide, we are actually characterizing whether a port is public or privately accessible, where it's located. So this is looking at homes by housing type, like single family or multifamily. We're also looking at 8 different public location types, like retail and recreational locations, like hospitals, healthcare facilities, schools, and more. It's all listed right here. And then finally, each charger is assigned a power level. So from level 1 and 2 AC charging to DC charging that ranges from 50 to 350 plus kilowatt. Our approach leverages a national modeling framework that we developed specifically for this study that standardizes a set of inputs shown here in blue, and then feeds those into each of the respective network design models. Charging demand outputs are kind of produced independently for EVI Pro, Road Trip, and On Demand. And then what we do is we recombine those load profiles in space and time, as is kind of shown here in this demonstrative figure on the slide, which allows us to produce a combined hourly load profile for a particular region that we use to size a network that's capable of meeting the peak of that simulated demand. So we're not looking at average utilization, we're actually sizing according to peak, which is kind of unique in this study compared to some others. I'll also note that each demand model leverages a separate data source, so we're trying to use best available data across each model. Other regional variations in our results are due to differences in the housing stock, which leads to differences in assumed home charging access with respect to different EV penetration levels. We're looking at different EV adoption rates. We're incorporating local vehicle type preferences. So in a region where there are a lot of pickups, we assume that they'll have more EV pickups, as opposed to some other regions which may have less pickups by default. And then we also include local weather factors, so looking at kind of the average temperature and more extreme temperatures within each region when sizing the network. These are the modeling assumptions for our baseline scenario. I won't go into too much detail here. You can read about them in much more detail in the report if you're interested. But just at a high level, we assume that the EV fleet is going to evolve from today's observed adoption trends. So that's the 2022 scenario into a 2030 fleet that contains mostly battery electric vehicles with majority larger body types. So these are more crossovers and SUVs as they become more available and cheaper. We assume that electric range, all electric ranges will continue to increase. And all of these are just kind of in line with consumer stated preferences and trends that we've been seeing, observing in the last 3 to 4 years. We also modeled the 2030 fleet as being more geographically distributed than what we see today. And this blue chart kind of shows for the baseline scenario where we assume EVs are going to be adopted. So within our regions, if it can vary from 3 to 35%. And this is largely just based on early adoption patterns, as well as the types of vehicles that exist within each of these regions. We estimate home charging access on an annual basis for all regions in the study. This is based on some of our previous modeling. And in this No Plates Like Home study, where we actually related home charging access to EV adoption or EV penetration, in addition to several demographic factors like income and housing type. So the chart on this slide shows the distributions of home charging access by region that we simulate in the years 2025 and 2030. Some general takeaways are that we estimate that home charging access is going to be higher in more rural areas compared to urban. This is just kind of due to the mix of housing types, as well as the levels of adoption, where we actually think that adoption will be higher in urban areas, at least over the next 10 years or so. And then you can also see here that it's expected to decrease with higher EV penetration. All of these dots kind of move down as you go to 2030. And that's because we model that having reliable access to a home charger is, it's already a major determinant of early EV adoption, and we expect that to continue, at least kind of in the near term while the public networks catch up. Yeah, I think that's all for this slide. Okay, so now getting into some of the key findings from the study. I just have 5 here, but there are many more in the report if you're interested in reading. It's 100 pages, so yeah, you have to get a coffee or something and sit down. But so the first here is, this is kind of the main figure. This is our projected composition of the national charging network for 2030. This is as modeled in our baseline scenario. So this is our most likely, we use kind of our most likely assumptions here in the baseline scenario that we think might actually manifest. So much like today, we find that convenient and affordable charging at or near a driver's home is going to be core to the ecosystem. But we also see that this must be complemented by further development of convenient and reliable public options. So just here we're breaking the network out into 3 separate segments. The first is private charging, which includes ports that are installed at single-family homes, multifamily properties, and private access workplaces. So this portion of the network is the largest. It's responsible for 96% of the port of the ports needed by 2030, but it's only responsible for around half of the overall investment, over that same time period. The second segment here is level 2 ports that are installed in publicly accessible locations where vehicles tend to dwell for extended periods of time. These account for 4%, 10%. Okay, well, should be back. And then finally, here, around 182,000 public fast charging points are going to be required at short dwell locations. While this may seem like a drop in the bucket with respect to the total size of the network at less than 1%, it's actually, these types of stations are quite expensive to deploy. At least, from early project billing data, we estimate that, if these types of costs persist through 2030, that these 182,000 fast charging ports could account for around 40% total investment needed. The second key finding is that we're mostly on track in terms of current network size and committed investments through 2022, which is kind of the initial year of our analysis. That said, continued growth and investment through 2030 is going to be needed if we're going to achieve our ambitious electrification targets. Additionally, as you can see here on the right-hand side in these two figures, we find that there's a lot of variation in the cost, both to buy and install EV chargers, especially the installation costs. This seems to be very site-specific, so it's hard to come up with a general rule of thumb, which is why we provide a kind of a low and high estimate here from a range of billing data and other publicly published numbers that we were able to find in the literature. So yeah, it could be, the cost estimates here could be very wide, but there is an opportunity to try to get closer to the low estimate to reduce your costs by selecting sites that are already have maybe the capacity, and for installers in particular, like I think Tesla's really leading the way with some of their prefabricated stations where they can really reduce installation costs and get closer to this bottom estimate as opposed to the high. Our third key finding is that charging needs are going to vary by vehicle type and for those with and without home and workplace charging. So in general, larger vehicles tend to have higher energy demands, which means that they're going to have higher charging power requirements. Plug-in hybrids may rely more on public level 2 charging, but that really assumes drivers are going to be willing to plug in when away from home at all. And there is some early data that kind of conflicts that assumption that says that plug-in hybrids tend to only really charge at home. But that's one of the things that we vary within our modeling, whether PHEVs would actually be charging in public. And then finally, we find that much like today, home charging can provide the majority of an EV's electricity demands. So that's this red bar here for those with res access. But not everybody is going to have home charging. So for those who don't, workplace and public DC charging are really going to be needed to fill in that gap and enable electrification within those segments. The fourth key finding is that public DC fast charging infrastructure in 2030 will serve multiple use cases. So we find that around 2/3 of the demand for fast charging will be for community charging in support of daily travel. Again, this is particularly for those that don't have that reliable home and workplace charging, in 2030, that are really relying on this part of the network. We model that 21% of fast charging demands are going to be for fully electrifying ride-hail operations. This will be primarily in urban areas. And then finally, just 14% of fast charging demand will be for long distance travel. And though it seems like a small number, these stations are actually going to be very critical for other reasons, like reducing range anxiety, promoting EV adoption, in the first place, where consumers will feel comfortable that they can drive wherever they want, and there will be charging there for them. The last key finding is that the composition of the public charging network is going to vary regionally, and it's going to really just depend on the needs of the region. So, for example, densely populated cities are going to require significant investments to support drivers in multifamily homes and for ride-hail EVs. And then conversely, more rural areas, if they have a major travel corridor, that intersects their city or town, they're actually going to need to provide charging for those that don't live in the region, but that are simply passing through on a road trip. So this table here kind of shows the cities and towns from our modeling with the highest share of DC ports required per registered EV in their region. And we see that in regions with major travel corridors like Merced in Bakersfield, California, or El Paso, Texas, this ratio can be 2 to 3 times higher than the average region. And that's solely due to just supporting EV road trippers that are passing through. So yeah, this report was released in June. It goes into considerably more detail, again, than what I was able to talk to today, but it is free to access here through this link. I'd encourage you to take a look if you're interested. And then in addition to the report, something that I'm pretty proud about is that we released many different data files. So this is kind of a snapshot of one of them shown here that contain the detailed modeling results for all of the geographies within our analysis. So all states, cities, towns, rural state areas, looking at both 2025 and 2030. And we're hoping that all this data, and we're also, yes, we have like 11 different sensitivity scenarios as well, which we describe in the report, which definitely changed the results. So hoping that all this data won't be too overwhelming, but can be helpful to a wide audience of planners and analysts who are kind of grappling with this uncertainty that I was describing around what to expect in terms of EV charging for their regions in the future. Starting to run a little low on time, I just wanted to mention, so like our national study does provide our best estimate of the infrastructure requirements needed to accommodate EVs through 2030. But we've received a lot of feedback, and we do recognize that some state and local stakeholders, they've been developing their own targets. They have their own assumptions that they would like to plan for rather than kind of take the ones that we pre-generated. And that's where EVI Pro Lite comes in. Yeah, this just kind of describes the approach where we want to try to make our research available to as broad of an audience as possible, make our complicated, complex modeling tools more accessible kind of to the general community. And then, yeah, so some of you, I don't know, may be familiar with EVI Pro Lite. It is a online web tool. It does provide public access to a simplified version of the EVI Pro model that I was discussing, but it does have configurable inputs. Over the years, it's been used a lot for kind of local planning studies, and it does contain 2 core capabilities. The first is a load profile tab that estimates that produces an EV charging load profile for a particular region under a set of assumptions, including some general charging strategies like load differing strategies and like a peak minimization strategy as well. So a little bit of like crude managed charging as well. The second is a charging needs tab. This is kind of in line with the study that I was just describing. It estimates the number of chargers that are going to be required for a particular region under a set of assumptions. And we've actually recently updated the charging needs tab to incorporate some of the modeling enhancements that were developed for the national study, just to kind of bring everything in line with our most recent modeling. Yeah, this is just kind of, so this is before, this is after our recent update. So if you haven't, if you have used this in the past but haven't checked it out in a while, I would encourage you to look at this new tool. It has many of the capabilities that I was describing here. Actually, like one of the main feature requests that we were getting for charging need tab 1.0 is that we did have some constraints around the fleet size and the assumption around home charging that really didn't allow users to simulate really high electrification scenarios. Those have been totally removed, so you can basically go up to 100% EVs in this new tool, and you can go down to practically 0% home charging. So it allows you to do some really extreme sensitivity scenarios. We also allow like increased chassis type representations. You can define your fleet in terms of number of cars, crossover SUVs, pickups, vans. We incorporate the region-specific travel behaviors from our national study, and then we also the outputs are now much more detailed, as I was describing. So they include the location types, they include the port power levels. Yeah, and it's also a refreshed interface. It looks much better now too. So I encourage you to take a look. The link is here on the slide. Okay, this is the final topic. I don't have too much to describe here. This is kind of an area of, I would say, emerging research at NREL. This is kind of, yeah, a very active area of research at NREL. And yeah, as I mentioned kind of at the top, so EVs are now beginning to gain market share beyond just the light duty vehicle segment. That's great news because medium and heavy duty vehicles are the second largest support of transport related CO2 emissions in the United States after light duty vehicles. They're also, major sources of local air pollution, which has negative health impacts for those living nearby. While medium and heavy duty vehicles have been slower to electrify to date, there are some reasons to believe that the transition to EVs could actually happen faster than light duty. So for one, medium and heavy duty vehicles, they tend to be driven more than light duty on average. And surveys have shown that operating costs like fuel and maintenance are often the largest expense for many fleets today. EVs, to their advantage, actually have much lower operating costs than diesel trucks. And that's due to the lower cost of electricity, but also their much higher efficiencies is actually the primary driver of that. So, fleet purchase decisions, they're going to be driven more by economics, more by the total cost of ownership for their fleet, especially when compared to personal vehicles. We may all think that we're these rational economists, but this has been shown time and time again to be false. But businesses, they're going to seek out ways to improve their bottom line. So once EVs exceed the point of price parity on a total cost of ownership basis, we expect that they're going to be widely adopted in commercial applications, especially as fleet operators become more familiar with the technology through pilot programs. This is just kind of a high-level charging pyramid paradigm that we've developed, where we might see the different types of charging for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. So, this is just a conceptual period. You might be familiar with the light-duty one. We just adapted it for medium and heavy-duty here. So the base here is depot charging. We think that this can cover a significant portion of the total energy demands. This is especially true for fleets that don't need to drive much in a day. Especially true if it's a return to base operation, where vehicles are constantly coming back to one location like a depot, where charging can be installed, and they could just do most of their charging there. The charging powers here are actually expected to be pretty low, so taking advantage of the long dwell times at the depot, especially for traditional shifts, like a daytime shift with an overnight at the depot. Second one here is opportunity charging. So this is when a vehicle is parked away from the depot. It could be while it's loading or unloading, or a driver is on break. Installing charging at these types of loading docks and whatnot could actually really increase the operational efficiency of fleet operations, because you don't need to rely much as on this next form of charging, which is public en route charging. So it's going to be trip interrupting. It's going to be needed as a safety net, much like for light duty vehicles, and it's going to be really critical for enabling regional and long haul operations. The charging speeds need to be as fast as possible to minimize delay and get vehicles back on the road faster. So that could mean charging levels in the order of hundreds of kilowatts up to 1 megawatt or more, really depending on the application. And that proposed paradigm is backed by some recent analysis where we looked at a data set of real world Class 8 truck telematics signals, where we take that data and then we simulate those diesel operations as if they were driven by EVs. And then we can observe kind of what their potential charging behaviors or infer what the potential charging behaviors would be and the requirements for electrification of those routes. So yeah, there's a lot in this study, but at a very high level, we found that off-shift charging at less than 350 kilowatt could provide a significant share of the total energy demand. And that was across all different operations, including long-haul trucks, which do take pretty significant breaks, which are federally mandated to be like 10 hours or more, so that a driver can stay rested while on the road. However, we do find that megawatt level charging is going to be needed for certain regional and long haul routes. And that's just really to avoid significant delays to existing operations due to the slower refueling times for BEVs. Yeah, this is just a compare and contrast of light to medium and heavy duty. Yeah, we're very familiar with light duty. With medium and heavy duty, there's going to be fewer of the vehicles on the road, but they're going to have higher per vehicle electricity demands. Their charging is going to be more geographically concentrated than light duty vehicles, which could pose a problem, for providing power to those individual sites, which are going to be, very high power levels, because we're actually, thinking that the charging power levels in some cases will be, well, across the board will tend to be like an order of magnitude higher, but could exceed 1 megawatt or more per vehicle. So it's definitely something that, while the vehicles may not quite be on the road today, they're really in the pilot stage. It's something that we need to start planning for today. Yep, this is just some conclusions. I mean, we've set some ambitious targets in the US to grow domestic EV and charging markets, but there's still this major challenge understanding how much charging infrastructure is needed, where it will be located. We've produced, some actionable planning studies that I've covered here. I have links to kind of all of them right here if you're interested in learning more. And then just to conclude, we're always kind of looking for feedback, recommendations, and new collaboration opportunities that can allow us to better understand and help ease the EV transition for others, especially those who are on the ground actually making it happen. So if you have any thoughts, definitely don't hesitate to reach out. Yep, that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Brendan. God, you packed a lot of information into an hour. And what's amazing is that most of our attendees kind of stuck around here until the end of the session. We have a few questions from our attendees here. The first one that I wanted to go to is related to the slides where you were talking about some of the NREL tools. And the question there was whether you have any models that focus on home charging.
Yeah, so EVI Pro itself, it focuses on destination charging, and primarily the largest opportunity within that space would be home charging. So EVI Pro covers home charging, including some of the potential overnight managed charging strategies, like deferring charging until a certain time of day, or staggered charging as well. So you can do some interesting things with actually when vehicles are charging overnight within the EVI Pro model. And you can do that too, I think, within the load profile tool for EVI Pro Lite. So I would encourage whoever asked that question to look at the load profile tool to see if it might be something that could be useful or interesting to them.
That's great. The second question was related to your discussion of the modeling approach and how you were treating assumptions for incentives to charge off peak or to kind of more of a managed charging. And that actually was the question that I had, right, is how does your study consider smart or managed charging and how that would affect kind of your network composition? So if we could speak to those assumptions, that would be great. Yep.
So actually for this study, we don't consider managed charging. So everything is unmanaged here. We do assume that there are some charge preferences. So getting into even more details, within EVI Pro, we have different charging cohorts. So we have a segment of the fleet that we assume has a free workplace charger, and they would take advantage of that to the extent possible. So even if they had a home charger, they would charge at work, which is one way that we can kind of incorporate some load shifting. But within each charging session that we simulate, it's kind of an immediate charging scenario. Yeah, I mean, like, so this is kind of an area that we're actually trying to start to explore now, because it could have an impact on network composition if we're trying to really incentivize managed charging. And it could deploy, I mean, it could really drive the deployment of certain types of charging as well. So again, one example would be you might want to deploy a lot more workplace charging in a solar heavy region, and kind of like the free L2 scenario I was describing. So if you have low cost charging, you could incentivize EVs to soak up the sun to the extent possible. You could also incentivize EVs to charge at much slower rates overnight, assuming they get the same energy delivered by the time they need to leave the next day. So looking at like a few different managed charging strategies, comparing the aggregate load profiles is something that we're kind of like actively doing some follow-on research.
Yeah, and I'm sure the effects of managed charging would have a differential effect depending on whether it's a public charging infrastructure, right, where curtailing charging is not necessarily the best solution versus, you know, other charging solutions.
Yeah, willingness to participate is also something that's hard. Yeah.
Right, but there's also one follow-up question that just popped up about whether you have any scenarios in which the majority of charging in the state occurs in the middle of the day, and that just gets us back to the you know, infamous duck curve and help with solving that problem, which comes from a lot of solar, right? And alternative solution being battery swapping, and maybe there's a need for a lot more of that. So any thoughts that you have on that, Brendan, are certainly welcome.
Yeah, we don't have a scenario that designs a network around, yeah, this like incentivized midday charging. So it would be, you know, a lot more workplace and public level 2 chargers in all likelihood. But that said, so the EVI Pro Lite tool does allow you to play with both workplace and home charging and kind of preferences for each. So if you're interested more in seeing how the load profile could shift, then that's something that, again, I would check out EVI Pro Lite load profile tool to see if I can help you to answer some of those questions.
We have one last question from the audience here, which essentially tackles some of the outputs from your study and kind of challenging a little bit multifamily, 500,000 of multifamily level 2 chargers versus 20 million single family chargers, saying that, you know, the multifamily charging seems quite low, and asking, kind of exploring how you got to those, and perhaps there's something about the assumptions and also how you feel about those numbers being outputs.
Yeah, so this is, again, a result of, so in the No Place Like Home study, which is kind of our, it's the study that we use to inform a lot of our home charging access assumptions. It was based on a national survey of, it was a national survey of the population where we ask, you know, what's your different housing type, like, and got collected information on demographics and housing. And then also asked about their potential or their perceived potential to have you know, an EV charger installed in locations where they're currently parking their vehicles, or, you know, if they could move their vehicles, or to a location where they could have charging. So just as a result of that, I think it's a lot of our findings where it's kind of more limited when it comes to multifamily is that historically there just has not been chargers in multifamily homes. And now that there are some programs to really incentivize that build out, but our assumptions are based on kind of a consumer perception before many of these programs like had actually, you know, started to. So again, this is such a dynamic area of research that we would love to maybe like resurvey this group in a few years and see if anything has changed.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great clarification. Speaking about this being a very dynamic area, one of the questions that came ahead of this dialogue was that, you know, the concern or the question around some analysts predicting that, you know, car sharing of electric vehicles will kind of continue playing an increasingly important role in the coming decades and will lead to a decrease in aggregate demand for power and subsequently EVs. And so the question was, how might that kind of affect the current planning assumptions? And if you've kind of have ways to incorporate or have already incorporated that into your assumption, if there's a way to play around with the data related to that.
Mm-hmm. So the question is that, so like ride sharing, ride hailing could continue to eat into, the personal travel market. And how
exactly. Yeah. Right. Yep.
We did not model a scenario like that, but we do have the ability to do that. Speaking to kind of like what my understanding of the model is, the models are, it would probably lead to a decrease in residential access, an increase in public charging needs. Unless, there are so many factors here too, because I don't know if, it all kind of gets down to who's driving the vehicles and where they live as well. But I think even TNC drivers who are able to install a home charger, and if, in multifamily homes, it becomes much easier to do so, they would prefer to charge at home. That's just something that we see. It's the most convenient option. So it really gets down to whether they have access to that home charger. They would not necessarily have a workplace charger unless they were part-time. And then the public network would have to fill in the gaps. And for ride hail, you really want to charge as quickly as possible to, again, avoid delay. So it would probably be higher power chargers as well. And you have to get into like, what are the TNCs doing? Are they developing their own private networks for their drivers? They haven't done much to date, but I think I'd be interested to see kind of how things develop over the next 5 years or so.
Yeah, such a dynamic place indeed. Brendan, thank you so much for joining us today and walking through this important study and the suite of tools that can help us plan better and play around with the various scenarios in this dynamic space. We really appreciate you joining us and in this PLMA dialogue. I want to kick it back to Rich to wrap us up.
Thank you, Cassie. And again, thank you to both Brendan and Cassie for bringing this interesting and excellent conversation to us today. And thank everyone that joined us in the audience and participated by asking questions in this load management dialogue. In addition, you can pick up this recording of this dialogue and other dialogues we've done on your favorite podcast channels. We have these out there, so Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, you can get the Load Management Dialogues and PLMA. In addition, we also have a YouTube channel, and you can get the recording of this within a couple of days later this week out on YouTube as well. And we have recordings of other dialogues that we've done earlier this year there as well. Also, later this week on Thursday, we're having another load management dialogue. This one focused on the time of use rate transition at Southern Cal Edison and their partners GridX and Oracle. This was one of our award winners from PLMA's 20th annual awards that we presented earlier this year. And this dialogue talks about the experiences and with that transition and what it took and the partnership that was required. In addition, just next week on Wednesday, PLMA's first EV symposium on managed charging will be in Detroit. There's over 190 people registered already for this event. It's going to be, the place to go to have a conversation about managed charging with so many players. And we have strong representation from the automotive OEM field as well there for this symposium and recommend that you check that out. Also on our calendar at peakload.org/calendar. And then also just a heads up, we will be later this summer, we'll be making available an online version of our very popular evolution of demand response to the distributed energy resources, which Kessie here has been one of the trainers for in the past. And be looking for that. We'll have an announcement coming up here in the next probably week to 10 days. And you can check out that as well as other things on our calendar, again, at peakload.org/calendar. So, again, thank you all for joining us today. You've been listening to a Load Management Dialogue presented by PLMA. To learn about upcoming dialogues and for an archive of past recordings, visit peakload.org or your favorite podcast platform. This concludes this edition.